Welcome back, artists. I'm Wyatt Paints, and today is the end of a very long wait for those following along with the Fantastic Four diorama. Johnny Storm is getting done today. Now, I've saved this one for last because of the family, the Human Torch's fire effect is going to take the most care to pull off. Not only is it going to require multiple color shifts in tiny distances, it's going to be done over a very complicated surface. Plus, I won't be able to use my typical painting order of going dark to light. I'm gonna have to invert it. And also, like all the other family members, I was able to keep this 100% hand brushed. So relax and grab a drink. I'm gonna grab my brushes. Let's get started. Getting started from a black prime, I entertained the idea of painting him in his full flame on state. But like with Sue, going all in on the power display seemed like an easy way out. And I wanted him to be a bit more cohesive with the rest of the group. But just know, painting the blue suit with protruding flames is going to be a little bit more difficult and a whole lot more nerve-wracking, but ultimately, I think it's the better choice. As with tradition, we're going to start with this navy blue for the base. This was very much like the previous 3 times painting the suit, but so far this is a nearly identical process here. The one obvious change is the addition of the flame details that get in the way here and there. Thankfully at this step, they aren't too big of an issue. I did have some problems with the sculpted flames, but that's something I'll touch on later. For now, it's all about laying down this base. Once it was based, it looked nearly the same, just slightly blue and kinda shiny. Magic Blue came in next for the mid-tone. This was applied with a medium dry brush for speed and control. With the flames in the way, some of the places can prove to be a bit tricky, as the flames will siphon off a lot of the paint before it actually makes it to the suit. In a lot of areas, this isn't too bad, and you can mostly ignore them. But one thing to keep in mind is that even though we're painting the whole suit right now, in this step, I like to shrink the focus down to I'm only painting this muscle. This way, each muscle becomes its own mini project, and giving each one special attention will pay off later. Once it was dry, it was ready for Void Shield as a final highlight. Again, I approached this with the mind of painting each muscle, so each one got a little love to bring out those peaks just a little bit more. Paying special attention to the grain of the fabric is key here. With a very light dry brush, frosting the edges of the woven grain will highlight without losing the deepest shades of blue. Frequent use of a texture palette helped to strictly regulate the paint on my brush, and when you're trying to go for a feather light dry brush, it is a must. As a side tip, if you're unsure about your paint load, use the back of your hand to check how the paint is behaving. As you can see, my hand palette gets a lot of use. With it all dry, the blue parts were done. Next, I used matte black to clean up the collar, gloves, belt, boots, and insignia. Not much to say here other than making sure to get an even coat with clean lines. Once dry, Johnny was already looking good. Next up, uniform gray for the soles of his shoes. Again, simple, smooth coats with clean lines. But since this went over black, I had to go back and add a second coat for full coverage. Once the shoes were done, I switched over to a small round dry brush to start stippling in the gray of the insignia. You want to use a light tapping motion straight up and down as you slowly build up the color. After a few dozen taps or so, I left it to dry for a few minutes and came back for a second layer for vibrance. Once I was happy, I moved on to ash gray as the midtone. Again, a few dozen light stippling taps focused in the center is all it takes to start stepping up the highlight. I'm looking for a soft edge to this, so a few slightly off-center taps won't be the end of the world. Finally, Starship exterior comes in as the final highlight. This shouldn't take more than a few handful of pokes to finish. Just keep in mind, we're trying to paint the background behind the 4, so try to ignore it and only judge what's behind. When it starts to glow, it's time to stop. Once it had time to set up, I hopped back to the magic blue I used earlier to paint the 4 in the surrounding circle. Using the belly of the brush makes this infinitely easier than trying to use the tip, so save yourself a whole lot of grief and have your brush almost parallel to the surface. So long as your brush isn't overloaded, this will prevent any overpainting of the blue into the underlying white. Just make sure to get the little bits that peek through the flames here. It's very easy to miss, but little things like this really look impressive later. With the suit all done, I want to take a moment to thank my subscribers over on Patreon. Each month, your support keeps me from having to choose between new paint and lunch. For that, I can't thank you enough. If you would like to join the Painting Pantheon, you'll find a link to my Patreon in the description below. Even if you don't have any extra to spare, you can join for free to get little sneak peeks of upcoming projects. Hopefully soon, I'll see your name etched into the Painting Pantheon as well. For now, let's get back to Johnny. With the body 80% done, I moved my attention to the head. Here's where I did a bit of flip-flopping. I couldn't decide what undertone I wanted for the skin. On one hand, I wanted a fair but sun-kissed Hollywood tan, but I also wanted an interesting contrast shadow. So obviously, the solution is just to paint 2 heads. For the first head, I used gnome flesh and light flesh. I started by mixing up my 3 tones at 75-25, 50-50, and 25-75 to give me a nice range to work with before laying down the base of pure gnome. As typical with painting light colors over black, this took a few coats to get the opacity I was looking for. And since I was going for a fair complexion, I needed the black fully covered before moving on. After a few coats, he was looking peachy. Time to step up to the next color. Even though this will go over 80 to 90% of the skin, I started in the highlight areas to make sure that they were more pronounced. So the nose, cheeks, and forehead got solid coverage while I feathered this out over the rest of the face. Once it was dry, I liked the look of it and didn't want to take it any lighter, so I moved on to the hair, using Deflector Shield as the base. Now, painting yellow is a pain, and trying to put it over black just compounds the difficulty. Because yellow has such poor coverage, the instinct here is to use more paint to get that coverage, but that is a painter's trap. The pigments will quickly build up and fill in any details and just look bad. Instead, it's best to lay down multiple thin coats, giving plenty of time to dry in between. It took me about 4 coats to get to this point, and all told, a total of 6 before I actually got to the vibrancy I liked. So go slow and trust with enough coats, the paint will get you there. Now for a bit of light tone. I felt some of the details got a little washed out with all the brightness, so I had a bit of definition by giving it an all-over light wash. Then I moved on to the face to add a bit more depth to the stronger details. Finally, I used a bit of lemon yellow for a very light dry brush on his hair. Once everything was said and done, he was looking every bit like the Hollywood playboy he is. Now for the second head. For this one I used Bad Bruise and Gnome Flesh. Once again, I mixed up a few intermediate tones, but this time I started with my 25-75 mix. This slightly bluish undertone is going to lend a bit of hardness to his facial expression in the way I was trying to avoid with his sister Sue. And since this is a much darker color, it was much easier to base over the black and only needed 2 thin coats. For the first highlight, as with the previous head, I'm looking to cover 80 to 90% of the exposed skin, leaving the first color only peeking out in the deepest of areas. And since this was so thinned down, it took about 3 coats before I got the color I was looking for. After a few minutes to dry, and I was starting to see Johnny, but he was looking very corpse-like and needed a bit more of a healthy hue. So I highlighted the face with the 75-25 mix until he was looking nice and fleshy. Afterwards, he was looking pretty good, but still slightly too blue. So I went back in with one more highlight using pure gnome flesh. Once it was dry, I had a feeling that this was going to be the head I was going to use. So I grabbed some sanguine and mixed it in with a bit of gnome flesh to paint the lips. This was mainly for his bottom lip, as the upper one is tightly tucked in and in shadow, so it could be mostly ignored. Then I mixed in a touch more gnome flesh to layer in a slight highlight. After a quick application of Starship for the whites of the eyes, I moved on to his hair. This time, I started with blonde shadow. Now, because I have darker tones in the skin, starting with a brighter yellow that I used before would be a bit off balance. So I needed a more subdued base for it to look like this hair belongs to this face. And I just so happen to have this desaturated yellow that fit the bill. Also, this way his blonde hair won't compete with the flames over brightness. And thankfully, this yellow had much better coverage, so it only took 2-ish coats to get the black covered. Once it was all set and looking good, I picked up pale saffron for the highlights. Now, because I used a desaturated yellow for the base, I needed a desaturated yellow for the highlight. If I used the lemon yellow from before, he would have ended up looking like he had dyed his hair to have frosted tips. And while that worked for Chris Evans back in 2005, I wanted a bit more of a modern look. After a solid dusting of all the hair, it was time to tackle the flames. Let's take a look at the pillar of fire first, so that we don't have to worry about any other stuff getting in the way. Here I primed this in gray, since I knew it was going to be a bright flame. A lighter primer coat not only makes it easier to get good coverage painting lighter colors on top, but it adds a bit of pop to the final look. Granted, you can get the same intensity over black, it would just take many more coats and a lot more time. So save yourself the headache and prime in gray. You could go with white, but I find that most white primers tend to be hit and miss when it comes to their finish, and I've ruined too many projects because of a chunky white prime, so I don't even bother anymore. Instead, I just dry brush Starship over the gray primer to get nice poppy highlights. That way, I get the benefits of a white undercoat without the risk of a chunky white rattle can prime. And since I want all the flames to look cohesive, I had to very carefully neutralize all of the flames on the suit using gray. Otherwise, I risk having green flames. Unfortunately, there's no easy technique for doing this. It takes slow, careful painting. Personally, I put on Dune 2 while I did this and only just barely finished before the movie did. Now to start coloring the flames with flat yellow. I used a heavy dry brush to get this into every crack I could, which led me to the first issue with this sculpt. There's a lot of extra and unnecessary elements that didn't really make sense. Like the original model had these things coming up from the fire that were kind of a cross between weird rounded lightning bolts or oddly shaped ribbons of lava. Either way, I didn't like them, so I clipped them all off. Also, this dripping lava area by his feet really irked me. One, because he's flying, so there shouldn't be any lava, only flames. And second, the way it's sculpted makes it incredibly hard to paint in there. I had to do a lot of brush abuse to push paint in there, and even then, I could only paint most of it. While it would be hard to see from a viewing angle, I know it's there, so it bugs me. Next, I moved on to the first highlight of Sunrise Orange. Using a medium dry brush, I went over all the flame details, looking for around 40% coverage. Now, when it comes to fire, the hotter it is, the closer to white it should be. So wherever we add this orange and later on red are going to be the cooler areas. So I want to keep this on a higher raised up details of the flame. As the further they are from the ignition source, the darker the flame will be. If you want a bit cooler of a fire, you can push this all the way to an 80% coverage. But for our supernova here, I wanted to go super hot. When doing this on the suit flames, it's a good idea to do it in sections and position the model so that the flames can be painted in isolation. You do have a little bit of leeway, just don't go crazy. While the orange and yellow are easy to clean up off the black, getting this on the blue will leave you with a slightly green area. If you do have an oopsie, you can try to cover it up with a light dry brushing of magic blue followed by the void shield. Once it was sufficiently orange, I moved on to bloody red for the final highlight. This needs to be given a reserved application to make sure that it stays within the orange areas. And I'm looking to cover only half of the orange or less. And I don't want it to look like I added red. It's more about adding intensity to the orange. With everything pretty much painted, one of the last steps was to get the eye decals in. And when the eyes are this small, it will take a lot of patience to get right. I ruined 5 sets of decals before I got a pair to sit the way I wanted. The best advice I can give you is to trim them down as much as you can so that they fit correctly. Even just a little too big will have the decal sitting up on the eyelid instead of on the eye itself. After a few touch-ups here and there, and a couple of details like the eyebrows, I glued it up and called it done. And I gotta say, this came out good. It was a long road to get here, but it feels good to scratch this off the to-do list. Now with this diorama, I found sculpt issues, but once it's all painted up and done, it's a pretty impressive piece to have on display. But what I want to know is what you all think. Is this something that you want to try and tackle yourself? Or would you only want to do one member? Speaking of that, my fellow YouTube painter Sergeant Digital Design painted his own take on the thing. Using his airbrush, he cranked out a great Ben Grimm in under 2 hours. Be sure to check out his video for an alternate take on the lovable blue-eyed brute. I already have my next project coming off the printer, so I gotta get back to work. Until next time, thanks for watching, stay creative, and always enjoy the process.
you.